Hello and welcome. Thank you to this session. Welcome to this session, which is on trains, planes, and automobiles, the future of transport. And I think there are three layers to this, really. One is overall transportation policy. What should be the transportation? What should we prioritize within transportation over the next 10, 20 years in the UK? I think the next layer is how do we localize that? How do we do as much as possible for communities and to make sure that their transportation issues are addressed? And then finally, sustainability. How do we make transportation as sustainable as we possibly can do? And I suppose the fourth that you could add really is how do we intertwine those elements so that we get the best possible results. I've got a great panel today. First of all, I can just say, just basic housekeeping, if you can obviously switch off your phones or have them on silent, that would be great. And also with the Q&A session, if people can come up to the mic as much as possible, that would be fantastic. It just makes life easier for us. So we've got a great panel today. I've got George Freeman MP, I've got Councillor Jim O'Boyle, I've got Councillor Steve Caldwell, and I've got Baroness Barker. And I'm going to start with George Freeman, who is MP for Mid-Norfolk and was a former Minister for Life Science in the Coalition government, but also very relevant to this conversation, Minister of State for Decarbonisation and Digitisation at the Department for Transportation, and also obviously convener of this great festival of minds that we've got going on right here. So I will start with you, George, for your initial comments.
Brilliant. Nick, thank you very much. And I hope everyone is enjoying this festival. Can I just do a show of hands? All those people for whom this is the first Big Ten festival? Yeah, the majority. And anyone not enjoying it? Good. That's what we want to hear. So an important point, please give us some feedback at the end of the day. We're always trying to improve it, and we can only do that with your feedback. So please email us and let us know your thoughts. And secondly, big shout out and hello to all those who are watching online. Big Tent is both a physical space here, and thank you all for coming, but it's also a digital community, and we've got several hundred people watching us on YouTube and on Twitter, and the whole thing being live streamed. So, future transport. I'm going to do three things, if I may. One is be terrifyingly honest about the failures of our current transport system. As a non-minister, I'm no longer in the government, I can do that. Secondly, then I'm going to restore some hope by telling you what I think we've got an opportunity to do and why COVID is a catalyst for us to do it, and then share with you my reflections on how we could actually deliver it and make this a moment where in future years people look back and say, well, I don't know how they did it, but after COVID they really got a grip of this agenda and transport in the UK was transformed. So the critique. I want to suggest to you that we have a Department of Transport that doesn't really do transport. When I went, as Prime Minister sent me to DFT as number 2, Minister of State for the Future Transport, to shake it up. And his brief to me was literally, go and do what you did as Minister for Life Science at the Department of Health and Bays. He said, you will find, fun enough, the Prime Minister, having been a mayor of London, knows the DFT well. He said, you will find it is divided into 4 types of people. People who work in road, in rail, in aviation, or shipping. And very few people think about place. Very few people think about people and places. And George, that's what you're all about. Go in and shake it up and shape an industrial strategy for the UK to lead in the amazing technologies that are coming in terms of future transport, but also shake up DFT so that it really grips the agenda around cleaner and healthier growth. And within a few days, I realized exactly what he meant, because as a new minister arriving at the department, you say hello to everyone in the lift. I mean, I never take the ministerial lift on my own. I want to meet the staff. So you're in the lift and I say, hi, what do you do? And people say, I'm in aviation, I'm in shipping, I'm in road, or I'm in rail. And essentially, what we've done is to silo different transport modes, and that siloed thinking effectively, and by the way, the department, the civil servants are brilliant people. This is not a criticism of them. In fact, of all the departments I've worked in, it's the most, funnily enough, the most driven with a sense of common purpose internally. But the structure isn't really about to me, transport is how you help people go between places. So it should all be about the people and the places. So when I, as Transport Minister, get the train back to my constituency in Norwich, and I get to Cambridge, and I get off the train, and there's 4 minutes to walk down and catch the Norwich connection, and the train from London is 4 minutes late, you expect them to just hold the connection for at least 60 seconds. Not for an hour, but for 60 seconds. Or at least tell us that we have to run. No one thinks about that. I got off, walked down, I've done it hundreds of times, got there, and the train pulled out. And I said to the guy, well, why didn't you tell us? It's not my job. It left on time. I said, but I bought a ticket from London to Norwich. I did not buy a ticket to Cambridge. I do not want, and I just share with you that we're running a transport system that isn't really working for the people or the places that it's supposed to serve. It's working, well, who's it working for? We've actually created in the Department of Transport a franchising, purchasing, supply chain system. It's all about big infrastructure, Highways England and Network Rail. And the whole of the purchasing model is how do we even out the purchasing? It was designed in the Treasury, so that basically big chunks of money, we're not having peaks before an election and then troughs and laying people off. Makes sense. But the whole machine now is devoted to rationing supply. So the A47 in my constituency, which David Cameron promised would be dualled 11 years ago, it won't be dual for another 20 years. So we're running a very top-down, bureaucratic construction procurement management system with tier 1 to tier 3 suppliers. It's really designed by the big construction companies in conjunction with the civil servants to make sure that big infrastructure is delivered. I mean, that's important. But I would suggest to you that is not the sole and defining mission of a transportation department. And I want to suggest that actually, if we're going to deliver cleaner and healthier growth, if we're going to make this year, this tragedy, let's not forget 120,000 of our fellow citizens have died, the nation put on $1 trillion of debt and 35,000 tons of fat, and we've all had a chance to hear the bird song and discover what we really care about. If we're going to make this a moment for healthier and cleaner growth, then transport is completely fundamental. And we haven't got a prayer of hitting net zero or preventing the obesity epidemic or preventing the mental health epidemic unless we start literally with the daily reality, the lived reality of people going to places. That's dropping the children at school, going to work, coming back from work. You can talk about HS2 all you want, but the reality every day, pumping out carbon from congestion and pollution, and living the obesity life in the car, living on a garage sandwich and a sugary drink. That's what we have to change. And in the end, to me, that is about creating a transport vision and strategy and financing system, which is based on actually allowing people in places to decide how they want to get to work. And so, first of all, it needs to be profoundly decentralized. Of course, central government should do the big motorways, the big infrastructure, but the local bit should be properly done and integrated locally. I have in my patch a new housing estate, 2,000 houses. It's 400 metres from a railway station and 700 metres from the A11. And the traffic is directed past the railway station, which is locked up on the south side, no access, under the tunnel. We're spending over £2 million opening up the tunnel, so the cars can drive into Wyndham Town Centre, pumping particulates into the lungs of our children, and then turn left or right to get onto the new A11. Wouldn't you want to put the 2,000 houses and advertise them as being on the railway line, 40 minutes to Cambridge? I mean, the dislocation between housing and transport is chronic, serious, urgent. And I don't think you can solve that in Whitehall with sort of joint working. We're going to have to really localise it, seriously localise it on the ground. So why am I excited? I'm excited because I think there's a new generation coming. And it's lovely to see some people in here who are not old farts, who I think are going to look at us in a few years and say, are you telling me you all owned cars? You spent 10, 20, 50 grand on a thing that you parked outside your house that deteriorated. You all owned cars? How weird. Isn't transport about getting from A to B when you want to, not owning an asset that deteriorates? I think there's a whole new generation coming who expect to want to walk to work, cycle to work, live healthily, take a bullet train when they want one, fly when they need to, They're going to expect to have green city mapper, have their carbon points. They're going to expect to be active citizens. They're going to want to manage down their emissions. They're going to want to pick taxi companies and train companies that are running green. They're going to want to use the power of market to drive that revolution. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for us to decentralize and integrate, localize and digitalize. And that's why I made my mission at DFT, decarbonisation, digitalisation and decentralisation. And I just close by sharing this with you. The strategy that we put in place, what I found actually in the DFT was in each of the 4 modes, there were people passionate about people, place and environment, but they were sort of relegated. So shipping is actually, per pound of haulage, the biggest emitting industry. I mean, it's enormous, all those ships pumping out diesel around the world. Download the app, a global shipping app, if you want to have a look at the ships going around the world pumping out diesel. And there were people in the shipping department in DFT who really get the future of shipping. There are people in aviation, but there was no proper structure. So I created a directorate called the Future Transport. And on the left-hand side, we had 7 work streams. The left-hand side was long-term industrial strategy, science, technology. Right-hand side was people and school gates. And the first was, what do we spend on R&D? Transport R&D. No one in the DFT knew. They said, oh, the bays do all that. So we got a grip of that, found out how much we spend. It's not that much, actually. And if we're really going to invest in tomorrow's helicopters, electric aeroplanes, green transport, light rail, and we need to invest in the R&D of transport. Second category, commercialization. What do we pull in internationally in investment? No one knew. No one in the DFT had asked that question. So I started asking that question, and what are we pulling in from big companies and startups? Third, test beds. Why don't we create some places where we can test out the autonomous vehicles of tomorrow, the e-scooters? Don't spend 10 years passing a bill licensing e-scooters. They'll have gone out of fashion by the time we do that. Let's create 5 test beds, digitalize them, let the mayors run them, gather the data, and if they're lethal in London and safe everywhere else, let's license on that basis. And let's lead in agile digital regulation. Third, digital. Let's create a transport informatics hub, gather all the data. At the moment, if you cross the country in a car, data is collected on you, but no one puts it together in one place. We could create an amazing transformatics hub where researchers, academics, scientists could plug. And, I mean, no country's got higher density travel than this country, but we don't use any of that data. 5 was regulation. Let's start doing really agile regulation based on informatics on what actually works. 6, decarbonisation. The Department of Transport didn't have a decarbonisation plan before I arrived. And when I said, and they went, oh yeah, they showed me a graph, went like that. That's how they're going to get to net zero. And I said, listen, as an investor, I never invest in a straight line. It must be rubbish. I mean, show me a line that goes, we're going to make early wins, then it's a bit slow, and then we get the dividends. Show me shipping, aviation, rail, and each mode must have a plan to how it gets to net zero. And can you please identify for me the 10 places that are worst emitters? I want to know the 10 worst railway junctions, the 10 worst, and start to localize it, and start to put some metrics, and then let's red, amber, green places on carbon emissions. Only when you red, amber, green, and you start to say to the MP Freeman, you know, your constituency is in the red zone, then everyone starts to take some responsibility and then go finally to families and households. And if your school had an app and you knew you were a red school, why? Because everyone's driving in single cars, people are turning up in SUVs, pumping out emissions, running over kids, compared to the other school where they're car sharing or cycling. When you start to localize and digitalize and empower, I think 1,000 flowers will bloom and people will start to create a transport system that works for them. So an intelligent market based on clear metrics, proper leadership from London, not what we've got at the moment, but most importantly of all, integration locally to allow councils to come together and build infrastructure that works for healthy and happy citizens.
Perfect. Thank you, George. I'm going to come on to Councillor Jim O'Boyle, who is a Labour councillor in Coventry, and in fact born and raised in Coventry as well. So I'd be very interested in your comments, particularly in relation to some of the things that George was saying about people in place and obviously decentralisation and all of that. So I hand it to you, Jim.
Thank you. Don't mind if I stand up, dear. You know, that's good. Yeah, George has set quite a challenge and demonstrates, I suppose, the breadth of the challenge that faces the country as a whole. Firstly, I just want to welcome you all to Coventry. So, as I was introduced, I was born here and brought up here. So, I'm invested in Coventry. And of course, you know, we are the City of Culture this year, and part of our culture is actually the British motor industry. You know, Coventry was the birthplace of the British motor industry. I worked in the motor industry. I worked at Peugeot at the Wrighton plant for a number of years. So I understand it's in our DNA. But I just want to talk about some of the projects we're involved in, the future of transport going forward here in the city, because we were pioneers in the old days, and we believe, and I believe, we're being pioneers today. We want to bring new technologies to the fore and to give people choices. I'm not going to stand here and say to you, you should do this, you should do that. I think it's right that we bring choices because people will have different modes of transport. So this is a quick run through of some of the projects in Coventry. Very light rail. Sounds like, something you've heard of before. What we're trialling in Coventry is completely unique. It's a collaboration with Warwick Manufacturing Group for Warwick University, Transport for West Midlands, and as a Labour council, as has been reported, I'm collaborating with Dudley Council, which is run by the Conservatives. I don't see this as a political issue. I see this as too important an issue to divide on political grounds. It's a reliable, environmentally friendly, battery-driven, hop-on, hop-off transport. It's about 5 times cheaper than Midland Metro. It will have a brand new track form that will completely revolutionise how you put track into the roadway, and it will run at a high frequency, and we aim for it to be autonomous in the future. It will have no overhead cables, and as I said, the track will be laid without the need to relocate services. When you lay track on street form, you have to move the gas, the electric, it costs millions. That is where the cost in on-street trams comes from. And I can tell you, Coventry Very Light and Rapid Rail, I've named it Covlar. I'm hoping it's going to catch on, so I'm saying it Covlar, Coventry Very Light and Rapid Rail. But also in Coventry, believe it or not, we've got the most on-street electric charge points anywhere in the country outside of London per head of population. And it's important that where people don't have the ability to park their vehicles off-street, there is on-street availability. And we're bidding for 400 more as we speak. In addition, yes, it's only 401, but compare that to some cities and towns that don't have any. We've made a head start in this. And we've got a number of rapid recharges that can recharge an electric vehicle in as little as 30 minutes. Now, here's something else. Self-charging roads. You must think I'm, been on the pot before I came in here. Actually, we're part of a project looking at the feasibility of wireless on-the-go charging for electric vehicles. It's the first study of its kind in the UK, and it will assess the viability of charging electric vehicles as they are driven. Interestingly, it's called Dynacov. I mean, it sounds like the local takeaway, but it's a dynamic charging of vehicles. It doesn't have to be private vehicles. This could be buses. It could be anything. Coventry is also the location for the UK Battery Industrialisation Centre, a cutting-edge research facility that will enable the scale-up and manufacture of batteries. Batteries make up around 40% of the value of a vehicle. They are difficult to transport, and they're expensive. So it's important as a country that both we develop the batteries of the future, and that's what UK BIC, which we bid for and won in 2017. There's no other place like it in the UK. In fact, there's no other place like it anywhere in Europe. But here's the point. We need to use that knowledge, we need to use that expertise to manufacture our batteries here. If our industry, automotive industry, is going to have a future, we need to build them and build them now. And that is why in Coventry we bid for the location of a gigafactory here. It would cost something like £2.5 billion to be operational. 78,000 new jobs could be created. It's a threat. A threat is, if we don't do it soon, we potentially could lose all of our automotive industry. But it's also a challenge because actually this is green transport and it's green technology, and we're looking at how the life of batteries, after they've done a period of time, what do we do with them after? There's lots of projects and work going on there as well. Coventry is the location for connected and autonomous vehicles, a project known as UK Autodrive It's a 3-year project where it's developing and deploying driverless and connected technology on the streets of Coventry. It's not just pie in the sky. Those of you who have come, whatever transport you've come today, one thing I can guarantee, you would have come on our ring road to get to where you've got to today. I've driven round the ring road, Coventry's ring road, in a car that drove me round it with no driver. So that technology is here now. We've got to develop it to the real world. That's what this is about. They're much greener technology as well, because you don't have the speeding up and slowing down and heavy braking, which causes particulates and all the rest of it. All of these little things make a difference. And Coventry is pioneering electric vehicles, as I said. The iconic London black cabs are built here in this city. We've got 70 vans and cars for businesses as a local authority. We're asking businesses to try before they actually buy them. We're the only city in the country who's won a bid via government to fund to make all our buses electric, and all our buses will be electric in this city by 2025. That's 297 different buses in our city. So all our buses in the next 4 years will be electric with no emissions. George mentioned e-scooters. We're trialling e-scooters. I'm not going to go on too much about that. It is ironic, of course, that you can buy a scooter privately, but you're not allowed to ride them on public roads. So we do need the government very soon to make a decision as to whether they're going to legalise them, because the trials have been not without their difficulties, but it's a mode of transport. A mile here, a mile there means they don't have to take the car. It's about joining up those different modes of transports. And anyone who's been around the city would have seen we're taking part as well in the West Midlands Cycle Hire. And I'll leave this final point, and this one should sort of make you think about. We're taking part as well in something called Urban Airport. So later this year, a trial is taking place in our city next to our railway station that is having an £82 million upgrade, the first upgrade it has had for 50 years since it was built. That was because it was the fastest growing railway station outside of London before COVID. Obviously, rail passenger use is now about 30% at the moment. It's quite low, but it will return. And we need that capacity. But also, urban airports, basically, it's about autonomous delivery drones and air taxis, and we'll be trialling them in this city later this year. These are just some of the things that are going on. You know, this is not a panacea, and I've missed out on loads of things I could talk about, but honestly, Coventry is at the hub of this new technological opportunity. And when people talk about the green industrial revolution, let me tell you, as far as I'm concerned, it is an opportunity, an economic opportunity that we shouldn't give up, but it's also the right thing to do, and it's happening right here in Coventry.
Thank you very much for that, Jim. Much appreciated. I will come next to Baroness Barker, who is the Lib Dem spokesperson on social enterprise charities and the voluntary sector for the Liberal Democrats in the Lords. So Liz, what is the future of transport in the UK?
The future of transport in the United Kingdom is entirely different from what we have now. Because what we have at the moment is a system. Quite who invented that system and for what purpose, I'm not sure. But the system that was invented really had very little to do with what transport really is about. And what transport is about, and should be about, is about enabling people to move between places for social and economic purposes. That's not what we've got at the moment. And we certainly haven't got a transport system that is rooted either particularly in environmental need, certainly not environmental need, nor social needs either. What we also have is a transport policy which favours certain modes of transport, in particular cars. And the reason we have a transport policy that favours cars is because of rural transport and the politics of rural transport. Because we're still subsidising, if you look at it particularly in the last few years, aviation and cars heavily subsidised in different ways by government. Trains, public transport, not. At the moment, because of the pandemic, buses and trains are being heavily subsidised. But the government has started to give out indications that certainly the subsidies for bus travel not likely to last very much in the future, and that is very, very important, because local authorities who truly understand the needs of local communities to rely on public transport particularly for work purposes and so on, are not going to be able to sustain that in the future, and that's difficult. The future of transport is about change. There are going to be, I don't need to go through them because they've already been expertly put. The technological change in transport is huge. The impact of that is going to be that people will be able to choose alternative modes of transport. And we know what determines people's choices in terms of transport. It is convenience, access, and safety. That's the three. It doesn't matter whether that, I mean, you can apply that to whether somebody takes the incredibly daring decision as I do to cycle in London. Those three things, or whether I decide that I'm going to fly or somebody's going to fly somewhere or go by train. That's what it's about. And what we have the potential to do, both commercially and at national government level and at local government level, is to bring about a huge change in the choices that people have that enable them to make healthier lifestyle choices. I'll confess, I'll come out. I'm a member of the All-Parliamentary Group on cycling, and we're now cycling and walking. And we are, at the moment, having a set of hearings about transport, to feed into the cycling and walking and infrastructure strategy, because they all call it CWIS. I mean, the moment you start talking about transport, people just go off into acronyms, just their own. Well, so CWIS, we're talking about. And in that, we are trying to do a number of quite important things. Number one, talk about parity between different road users. We had until recently a highway code in which car users had a supremacy in it. We still do in terms of the way we deal with it in the criminal justice system. But we actually have to have policies which translate into physical manifestations of that policy, in which we have streets and roads which are about parity between different users. And you can only do that and make sense of that on a regional and local basis. I know somebody talked about motorways and arterial roads. If there is no connection between that and a regional plan or a local plan, you're going to get to the edge of Coventry, and suddenly nothing makes sense anymore. It makes sense anymore. It doesn't. We really need to be doing that, because it is actually, I think, out in small towns and in rural areas where we can have some of potentially the biggest change. Some of our witnesses to our inquiry yesterday were talking about the fact that we've had a huge amount of success in doing that job of joining up different modes of transport. We are beginning to see around the country more and more stations at which there is secure bike parking, and that makes a huge difference. Not least in your part of the world. People want to go further and do swap-up schemes whereby people can exchange use of their bike at one end of a journey with somebody else at the other, so that we can make better use of things. But one of the most interesting things for me was we are beginning to change our attitude towards bikes. Because we're Brits, we think that e-bikes are cheating, really. And unless and until we get through that, and we're beginning to do it, we're not going to make the amount of change, or the rapid change that's going on in places like on the continent. But we're beginning to do that. And then we get into things like cargo bikes and e-cargo bikes. And those are a point of real change. Somebody's been doing a bit of research looking at that at the moment. At the moment, do you know what's the biggest cargo for cargo bikes? Children. School runs. That kind of stuff. That's the point at which you begin to see how transport use changes. When people can see the difference to them and their lives, then they begin to start doing things that they previously thought they weren't going to do. And that leads to two things. One, there needs to be sustained investment. But two, people need to see that if they are going to change their transport use, the benefits and the economic benefits of doing so are going to be kept where they live. That's how the change in London happened all that time ago, because Londoners saw that there was going to be investment in buses and so on. That has not happened in places outside of London. And that's why it is really important that lying behind those great technological breakthroughs and plans, there are locally accountable people working to demonstrate to people around it, yeah, you can change, and it will be convenient, it will be accessible, and it will be safe.
Thank you very much, Liz. So I shall now pass the floor over to Councillor Steve Caldwell. He is a Green councillor in Solihull. I'm very interested to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. I'm going to keep this brief because I think these conversations are much better when we get some interaction from the floor. My name's Steve Caudwell. I'm a councillor in Castle Bromwich, which is in North Solihull. I'm also the leader of the opposition on Solihull Council. And a couple of you may have recognised me because I was the Green Party's candidate for Mayor of the West Midlands this year, where we came third. For me, the future of transport, if we're going to answer that question, we have to ask ourselves why we're actually asking it. And I'm going to play with type slightly here and say the reason we're thinking about the future of transport is because we're in a climate emergency. And I think we all know that, and I think that's well understood. And on that basis, the future of transport has to be whatever helps us to defeat the climate emergency. And what I will point out here is we've heard a lot about growth and economics, and that's fine, and we have to have a focus on economic growth, but we also have to remember that we're talking about a finite planet here, and we cannot prioritise economic growth over the health and safety of our planet, because it's our planet that nourishes us, keeps us alive, allows us to flourish. So the Green Party has quite a well-developed set of transport policies. They're available on our website if you feel like putting yourself through that at any point. We talk about a hierarchy of modes, and I think Liz has touched on this already. We talk about active travel, so that's cycling, walking, first and foremost. Then we talk about mass transit, trains, trams, light rail, buses. And then we start talking about motorised transport. And I think it's really important that we look at the answers in that way, because as well as the obvious benefits in terms of emissions, and we need to remember that in the West Midlands, a third of all our carbon emissions come from transport. So it's a huge issue that we need to get under control as quickly as possible. As well as the obvious savings in emissions from cycling and walking, there's the public health aspect, which is a huge potential benefit for us as a society as well. Sitting in cars, as George mentioned, it's actually really bad for you from an ergonomic perspective, from a lifestyle perspective. It's something that we need to do less of. Everybody having cars means there's no space on our pavements. And I do mean our pavements, I don't mean our roads. We've had cars piled on roads for many years, but what we're seeing now, I see this in my ward, I see this in Birmingham and in Coventry and elsewhere, is that we're now seeing cars piled on pavements because there's nowhere else to put them. And that's a problem that we need to really grasp the nettle and address. The demand for mass transport, or the driver for mass transport, is economic as well as ecological. I remember a really excellent piece that was on a website called City Metric that explained how at peak travel time, Birmingham is only half the size that it actually is in terms of a travel to work area, because people can't actually get the transport to get them to job opportunities because of the level and the nature of congestion on roads at 8 in the morning and 5 in the evening. And I think it's really important here to call out that EVs and electric vehicles are not a solution to that problem, because an electric car takes up exactly the same amount of space on the road as a fossil fuel car. An electric car will kill you just as well as a fossil fuel car will if it hits you at 50 miles an hour. There are many ways in which electric cars do not actually solve the fundamental issue of us having too many pieces of tin on our roads. And I think we need to be aware of that and call that out. Having said that, obviously some people need to use cars to get around, whether it's for health reasons or for transport or for family reasons or for work. And of course, electric vehicles and possibly hydrogen vehicles, when we talk about mass transport, should be part of that solution. But for me, there's 3 challenges. There's the cultural challenge. How do we as a society in this country get from where we are today, which is a massive level of car dependency that I think is embedded to a level where we don't even recognize it anymore. We don't realize quite how car dependent we are as a society. And Liz made some great points about rural transport and how actually if you're in the Meriden Gap, you don't have a lot of options. You kind of have to own a car, otherwise you're housebound. And that's a really important challenge for local authorities to grasp. But there's that cultural aspect. How do we move away from cars? How do we move back towards walking and cycling and public transport? Like we see in Europe, go to Holland, car ownership incidence is much lower than it is in this country. But even other areas of Britain, in Manchester, London, these areas are just starting to make that movement away. And it feels to me, I'm not a West Midlands native, you can probably tell from the accent, but it feels to me like this is a really thorny issue for us to grasp here in the West Midlands because we are the home of British motor manufacturing, because Coventry has got that history that's steeped in car manufacturing, because Birmingham was Motor City, and because our towns and cities were bonded by ring roads. Wolverhampton's the same, Birmingham's the same. Those all pose really difficult challenges for us to overcome, and I don't think we start to break those challenges down until we accept what they are, and we actually do accept that, yeah, we've got a car problem. Just a point to think about at the end. We've spoken about COVID and how COVID is a really big opportunity for us to build back better or to do things differently or however you want to describe it. Car usage is now at 109% of pre-COVID levels. So we're not building back better at the moment. We are going back to the way that things were before, and it's even worse. Whereas, as George has said, train usage is 30% of pre-COVID levels. That isn't something that we can let a market sort out. That has to have clear intervention from government at all levels. In Solihull, I can say that we have a cycling and walking strategy. We have a local cycling and walking infrastructure plan that sets out how we're going to do cycle lanes, bus routes, maybe even one day low traffic neighbourhoods. If the administration there decides to grasp that particular nettle, I think that might be a little way off yet.
Buy a tin helmet.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, Birmingham's introduced clean air zone. Again, these are things that we have to grasp that nettle. We have to think, okay, that's probably going to be unpopular, but it's not as unpopular as rampant climate change is going to be in the next 5 to 10 years. And it's difficult for us all as politicians, I think, to have those conversations with you, because as soon as you say to someone, you can't drive your car anymore, we're not going to have jobs anymore because you're not going to vote for us. I hope that might be slightly different in this room, but more generally, that's the challenge that we have as trying to be opinion formers, but at the same time being constrained by public opinion. But I think it falls on people like us who come to panels like this to be that little bit braver and to say, well, actually, if we're going to defeat this issue, this climate emergency that we face, it's going to take some hard choices, and we have to talk about them so that you know what choices you want to make. I'll stop there.
Great.
Thank you.
Right, so there's a lot to pick apart here, but I'll start with a rather big question, which is, and some of this has been touched upon in your remarks, and it's really about the rub against, to some extent, or let's say playing devil's advocate, saying you're going to have an issue between the local and the sustainable. Sometimes they come together. Obviously, Jim pointed out, Coventry and electric transportation. But sometimes there's going to be a rub against between what the local community wants and sustainability. Liz had a great point about it. Well, if you can particularly create the narrative that the benefit's going to be seen in the community, you can get round lots of that. But is there more to the story than that? I'll let anybody come in that has an idea.
I'll go first if you like.
Go on, Steve. Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting question. So one of the Green Party's core political philosophies is this concept of localism and the idea that actually decision-making should be delegated to the lowest possible level. So I feel that that's something that, as a principle, local communities should always have the best possible level of consultation and, where possible, the final say on what gets done to them. And it shouldn't be done to them. In fact, it should be done with them. Having said that, I think that idea of delegating responsibility also means that sometimes you have to think, well, actually, this isn't something that you can decide on that atomic basis. Defence policy is a great example of this, right? If every village had its own defence policy, we'd be living in a very interesting country.
Indeed. I think Norfolk still has a...
Well, it's possible.
They still have a secessionist movement in Norfolk.
Yeah, and in Cornwall as well. So I think that's a challenge that you can overcome if you have a clear strategy that is well understood and that is bought into. And importantly, I think we spoke about local authorities earlier and how local authorities need to be leading on some of these things. That's great when they've got the money to do it, and they don't at the moment, and they haven't done for a really long time. So yes, let's devolve as much as we can. Let's recognise where we need national strategy. But if we're asking our local authorities to take action, let's give them the bloody money to do it, because that's not happening at the moment.
I think a couple of things. Just before COVID, I met somebody with the most fantastic job. He was going off to do it, to make our armed forces carbon neutral. What a cracking job that is, isn't it?
Wow.
Yeah, huge. The question is about how you calculate the cost, isn't it? You can calculate the cost to a community in terms of how much they're going to pay. Calculate the cost in terms of health, air quality, whatever. And I'm not talking about manipulating people into doing stuff. I'm talking about trying to involve and engage people with as much and as full information as possible. And I think people, and particularly young people, are getting that. They're way ahead of the rest of us, as old, boring old people. They can see it. And, you don't have to be that smart in London to know that air quality is so bad that it is having a deleterious effect on the population. And when you give people facts like that, they begin to change their minds.
Agreed.
I've only got one. There's a few questions.
Yeah.
At one point, I couldn't agree more with you that if you could put a cost number on obesity, congestion, pollution, all those things we don't want, on a place, and you could then say, guys, if you could reduce that cost, you can keep half the saving and put it in locally. I think 1,000 flowers would bloom, and people would say, did he just say we can keep half the cost? And the truth is, we're wasting billions at the moment. And the Treasury hate this, by the way, which is probably why I've never been a Treasury Minister. But they have actually, the people in the Treasury, they've, in the West Midlands, calculated that obesity, it's the obesity capital of Europe because it's been designed around the car, costs the West Midlands economy $4 billion a year. I don't know if it's right, it's probably wrong, but let's take it. It's a Treasury number. I'd love to be able to say, okay, that's the $4 billion, and in the next few years it's going to go up if we carry on as we are. If you, good people of West Midlands, led by your great leaders, can reduce that number, which I think you've just demonstrated you can keep half the saving and put it back into local bike routes and walking routes. I think, a lot more people would say, I want to go into local government. Wow. And it would just turbo you, because once you've got that, you can then go off and raise money and say, I'm guaranteed by Freeman and the Treasury that if I can reduce that cost, we get the money back. Will you loan me the money to put bike routes in? And to me, that decentralised, place-based costing model would unlock a revolution of investment. But anyway, I'm conscious we ought to hear from some of the folks here.
Let's just try and get some...
We've got 5 minutes, I think.
Okay,
Was
we've
it
got
5
5
seconds?
minutes. It is 5 minutes, so because if we can keep the questions brief. I'll just go to this lady right here in the middle.
So David King has said recently, he's the ex-chief scientist, by the way, he set up the Cambridge Climate Repair Centre. So he's a fairly big cheese. He said very recently, there is no budget left to stay at or below 1.5 degrees, right? That time was 10 years ago. If he's right, and I'm not a climate scientist, so I'm going to go with Sir David, right? So there's eminent scientists saying we can't make 1.5. We've seen what happens at 1.2. We've seen transport systems collapsing across the industrial world in the last couple of weeks, New York subway, underwater. What have I heard here today, apart from the Green Councillor, that is actually addressing that level of risk? That where is the mobilisation plan? I'm not talking about clever accountancy tricks. Where is the investment and the money to invest in and adapt our transport system?
Okay, wonderful. I'll take another two. Yeah, the chap at the back. Yeah, with the glasses.
I have to say that the current state of our transport is a failure of the political process itself. Like, for example, all of the nostrums that we hear and the ideas we see, they won't make road journeys quicker, cheaper, and cleaner. And the reason for that is that all the thinking so far, particularly on road transport, is under the paradigm of private vehicles and public routes. Whereas when we look at the needs for everybody to travel, it's if you can increase the speed of transport, you either decrease the time spent getting to work, or you can parlay that into an increased radius, and therefore greater specialisation and greater social and economic opportunities, that's the catalyst of growth. Now,
We just don't have a lot of time, so if you could, if you have a question.
The two greatest things that happen in transport that happen in the world, in the UK, railways and toll roads, and they were both generated under the paradigm of private vehicles and private routes, toll funding. And that whole area is being completely missed, and it's necessarily missed because the politicians, it's completely outside their sphere. So
No, that's great. Yeah, if it's quick, yeah.
Yeah, just something actually really quick. And this expands into different facets, not just transport, but relating to transport. Something we keep talking about. I come from Wales, and we use decentralisation all the time. But what we actually mean is devolution. And the two things are completely different.
Absolutely.
Completely different. You know, it's something actually I know that George will sort of know what I'm talking about, because I remember something that Maurice Glassman talked about, whereby what if we just put a rocket up this whole idea of centralised government, and something as radical, and this would affect transport, believe me, where we created a dual ownership per parish between individual owner of their property and the community, which meant that every time any decision was made, parking on the streets, cycleways, I remember growing up when they got rid of the railways that we used for industry, and and the council wanted cycle paths. I love cycle paths, I cycle, but at the time we had railways that we could have used for it, and we decided not to. But the council said, well, we're going to do it anyway, even though we elected you, and apparently that's decentralisation. It's not. It's just centralisation moved down a notch. I think we need to stop clarify this difference between decentralisation and devolution, and actually we need something across the board, not just transport, which puts a rocket up the whole idea of centralised governance arts, pardon the expression. So, and which means that all of a sudden we do have a genuine say what happens, when it happens, what gets built, what doesn't get built, what car goes on the street, what car doesn't go on the street, what nuclear energy is built on the road, what isn't. And what that means for us, employment, transport, everything else, as opposed to it being, we have a say every 4 years between some guy that says he's going to do something and doesn't do it, and the other. where we have an actual say in politics. I don't want to sound some sort of 1930s anarchist here, but maybe I am, maybe why not? But we just need that thing in terms of the whole thing in this bottom, and it starts to feed its way up as opposed to at the top and feed its way down. Awesome.
Thank you, guys. I don't have time for any more questions, and I don't actually have time to have the panel answer any of that because we are completely out of time. Thank you to everybody for coming, and thank you for a great panel. And the closing remark I would say is I talk a lot across. I'm a policy generalist. I talk to a lot of policy areas. And the one thing I'd say is whatever you fear about the state of transportation in the UK, the fact that we've got a cross-party panel, we've got Labour, Tory, Lib Dem, Green, and actually there's a thread through. There's actually, there's some disagreements, but actually there's a lot. I think there's a lot of coming together about where we need to be, which I think everybody should be encouraged by. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much for coming.